to El Paso, to northern New Mexico, you're going to see that we all intersect in a beautiful way. And so this is a timely story, it's relevant, and if you all could welcome Dr. Nelson, and I'd like to thank CCA for supporting this. Welcome, Dr. Nelson.
Okay, so Marisa is like everything else. Like, you all wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her. I would just be the homeless dude that they kicked out of Dunkin' Donuts. If you're not familiar with Dunkin' Donuts incident, you'll read about it later. Okay, so today we're going to do a few things. Because we have this particular audience, we're going to do two things. We're going to use the Blackdom narrative so that we all can intersect at that point. And so that's what you're going to have now. However, we all come from different places to this intersection, so let's watch this first.
You treat other people like the race that is on their side, okay? So everybody has a different race. Nobody knows what their race is. You know, this isn't just an exercise. This is real life. And I have a dream that you will really let the sparks fly. Get her done.
There's this great Chris Rock bit about how streets named after Martin Luther King tend to be more violent. I'm not going to do it, but it's...
Oh, this is a good one.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, how are you?
Great.
I admire your cultural success in America.
Thank you.
Olympics of suffering right here versus the Holocaust. Come on.
What am I supposed to
It's
be?
gonna percolate. No. Well, that was inadvertent. We didn't actually plan that.
Lots of cultures eat rice. Doesn't help me. I'd like to apply for a loan.
That's nice, Dwight.
What could you mean? Something stereotypical so I can get it really quick.
Okay, I like your food.
Outback Steakhouse. I'm Australian, mate.
Pam, come on. I like your food. No, come on. Stir the pot. Stir the melting pot, Pam. Let's do it. Let's get ugly. Let's get real.
Okay. If I have to do this, based on stereotypes that are totally untrue, that I do not agree with, you would maybe not be a very good driver.
I'm a woman. You want to go to the beach?
Sure.
You want to get high?
No?
I think you do, Mom.
Okay, all right. No, it's good. You need to push it. You know, you need to go a little bit further. All right. Okay. Kelly, how are you?
That belongs to me.
Oh, welcome to my convenience store. Would you like some googie googie? Well, I have some very delicious googie googie, only 99 cents plus tax. Try my googie googie. Try my googie googie. Try my googie googie. Try my...
Right on.
All right. Yes. That was great. She gets it. Now she knows what it's like to be a minority.
Okay. So, that can get pretty awkward, right? Saying the wrong stuff in a room full of people, particularly today, right? If you say something wrong, oh my, you are a... It's not what we're doing here today, okay? What we're doing here is providing a safe space, even when we say things and do things like what you just saw. We're going to have a little bit of intersectionality training because of this particular audience. So this is what we'll cover. Please pull out your phones. We're going to have a few minutes for this. Please pull out your phones. Turn it on silent, but I want it on. Please raise your hand if you have unlimited service. Raise your hand if you have unlimited service. Okay, everyone raise your hand and then stand up, please. If you can. If you don't. Okay, so if you have unlimited service tonight, you're going to lend that privilege to everyone else who doesn't. Because you're going to be a part of the experience. Okay, you may have a seat. You all see them? Okay, good. So this is what we're going to cover. Please turn your reader off. Race in Blackdom. It's called Blackdom. We're going to get to that in a minute. The Afro Frontier. To get my PhD, I had to write a dissertation, and it was on Blackdom. Within my dissertation was the theory of Afro-frontierism. That's what I'll be talking about at the Western History Conference. The Afro-frontier, raise your hand if you're familiar with Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis, the frontier thesis. This is a new thesis. This is a frontier thesis from the perspective of black folks. Black, and I'm going to say non-Hispanic for a particular reason. You'll find out later. Okay? And lastly, we're going to get to the point where we can at least begin a conversation here. Race doesn't exist. Now, that's the beginning of the conversation, not the end. Okay? It's the beginning, because while race doesn't exist, racism does. Your voice. Okay, this is my voice. I broke it down into the pieces where you can find me. So, instead of yelling at me here today, you can yell at me for the rest of your life on Twitter, Facebook, all of that other stuff. But today we're going to play along because the intersection is what we need to teach people how to get to. Okay? Now, I teach classes, and very few times, okay, never, has there ever been a historian to have an intro, right? Like a real intro, like, you know, if Jay-Z was coming out, he wouldn't just come out, he'd, you know, flames and everything. So, okay, so this is my version.
I went looking for I found it. Black. It's not a place. It's more an idea.
That particularly for the end, because the end, my little daughter, she's watching. So I just wanted her to see herself alive. But she's my why. Her mother is from Iowa, and for this purpose, because we haven't gotten that far in our lecture yet, her mother is white and I am black. And so in teaching about this intersection, I'm teaching my daughter the whole time. I'm helping her to understand this new world that she has to exist into. So this lesson is built with her in mind. You just get to participate. All right, so I get 10 volunteers if you know your ABCs. Raise your hand if you know your ABCs. Please stand if you know your ABCs. Please stand if you know your ABCs. All right. Okay. Let me see. I can't see you in the back, so go ahead and sit down. The further back you are, go ahead and sit down because I can't see you. No, you stay. No, you don't try to get on me. All right, so I'm going to point to you, and you're going to give me the letter in the order because we know the ABCs, right? You ready? You ready?
Ready. Maybe. A.
B.
C. D. E.
F.
G. H. I.
J.
K. L.
M.
O. P. Q. R.
S. T.
U. V.
W.
X.
Y. Z.
Backwards.
Z. W.
Yeah, you Go ahead, sit down. Go ahead, sit down. Go ahead, sit down. See, the other ones in here have either been through this experience or they knew, oh, he's setting us up. However, they were sitting there going, well, I know my ABCs too. We say we know things that we really don't. Because if you knew them, you could do it backwards. If I said, do you know your numbers 1 to 10? You could probably do those. Because you know them. So, I'm going to give you the narrative that is out there for Blackdom. Now, it bores me to tears. I apologize, but it does. However, when I get really bored, I'm going to cut it off. It won't go any longer than 10 minutes. I suggest that you take out your phones. This is the time where you can use those phones. And it's okay to go to, you ready? You got the Google out? Take out the Google. You know all of those with unlimited access. If you can, go to blackpass.org and you're going to search for Blackdom, New Mexico. I'm going to say it again. Blackpast.org. Past, P-A-S-T.org. Now, this is a site where you can get a lot of black history from. So you want to know it because we're going to come back to it later. So if you can't get it now, it's okay. It's the narrative that I wrote about Blackdom. I tried to change it on Wikipedia and they wouldn't let me. So I got beef with Wikipedia, so that's why I'm sending you to blackpass.org. Okay, some of y'all got it? Okay. Now, I'm gonna let this narrative roll, but as soon as I get bored, I'm gonna go ahead and change it. Go ahead and press forward. Remote. Oh, where's the remote? There we go. No, to the next one.
We are learning improv from us. Today we're going to show you how to play.
Next one. There we go. Oh, I fast forwarded for you. It's 20 minutes. I made it 10.
A small town once lived here, in the wide open spaces of opportunity. It was a modest town on the plains of the New Mexico territory. Begun in the early 1900s, this pioneer town was different than most built in the West. It was heralded as the first exclusive Negro settlement in the New Mexico. It was a place where blacks could truly be free, a planned colony where they could determine their own destiny and not be attacked and harmed because of the color of their skin. A man from Georgia named Frank Boyer founded this town and called it Blackton. It was more than a claim staked in the dirt. Moral stewardship, personal freedom, and ethnic pride. These were the cornerstones that Boyer used to support families and build a community.
A leader is someone that can motivate people to do things that they have not done before. So here is Francis Boyer motivating people to say, yes, we can establish a whole township. It's possible, people. We can name the town, we can name the streets, we can have our own schools, we can have our own post office. We have these skills. That's the knapsack of experiences that we brought from a period of slavery. Let's do it. That was the leadership.
Little is known about Frank Boyer and the town of Blackton. History has often overlooked the contributions of Black Americans. Boyer was a child in Georgia when he first heard about the West, his imagination sparked by his father's memory of the vast, unclaimed land of the Southwest. Frank's father was Henry Boyer, a free Negro from Pullman, Georgia, who served as a wagoneer in Colonel Alexander Doniphan's army of Missouri Volunteers, fighting in the Mexican-American War. Henry was not the only black to see the potential of a new start on the Western frontier. Blacks had gone to the West as part of the military, as workers on the railroad, as cowboys, fur trappers, and colonists.
Most people simply believe that the first blacks who came to America were slaves. That is not necessarily true. The earlier blacks who came here as they explored with the Spanish came to this country. They weren't all slaves. Some of them were soldiers and some of them were freemen, just like the Spanish citizens. The West really was somewhat uncharted territory. A man was gauged by his ability and his skills and his character more so than the color of his skin.
After the war, Henry went home to Georgia, enchanted by the West and undoubtedly impressed upon his family the opportunity for a future in the unspoiled New Mexico territory. Henry never returned, but his son, Frank, grew up listening to his father's tales, the words of the black leaders of the time.
This period after the Emancipation Proclamation is probably one of the most interesting and exciting periods of the experience of the black race in this country, and just Black America in general, because never before had a group have to decide how shall we live out our lives.
Let's look at the contemporaries of Francis. There was a W. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, of that era. Certainly, he was influenced by those influences. We're influenced by the people that we live with during our time. He was influenced, and what he saw, perhaps, as I tried to imagine the energy and the enthusiasm and the emotion that gripped him, that we needed a Moses, someone that would lead people out of continued Jim Crow laws after the Emancipation Proclamation. So here is a man being influenced by the contemporaries of his time, saying that there is something in me that says that black people in this country, the Negro people, can have a better life.
Frank grew up in the years after the Civil War, a time when blacks had never experienced so much opportunity and so much hatred. They were becoming teachers, lawyers, businessmen. In reaction, Southern politicians sought to destroy rights while violence threatened their daily lives. In 1877, Reconstruction failed. Union troops left, and angry mobs killed nearly 2,000 blacks. To be free. Black communities sprouted from Kansas to California with the greatest concentration in the Oklahoma Territory. This migration was much larger than what is recorded in the history books. Nearly 40,000 blacks alone migrated to Kansas between 1877 and 1880 during the Exoduster movement.
In the West, a lot of times they were going completely without any realization of what this might mean. But they were willing to take that chance. They felt we have no other choice. We either become subjected to this ongoing oppression or we begin to take our lives in our hands.
So the West was an escape valve. It was a haven. It was the promised land. It was like a magnet drawing people from something bad. It was like the legacy of the children of Israel leaving an oppressed bondage and going to find freedom to establish their own property in their own land.
Educated, charismatic, proud, and poor, Frank Boyer grew up in these times and also wanted to leave the South, but realized first that he must complete his education. Working his way through schools, he eventually graduated from Morehouse University and began to teach. Frank had the courage to teach Black history to his students, an extraordinary idea at the time, and one for which he was severely reprimanded. Frank continued his work in Black history during his free time and traced his own roots to the Igbo people of Nigeria.
My grandfather always wanted to teach Black history. He wanted them to know what was going on. He felt like they needed to know their roots in order for them to figure out where they were going to go from then on. They were more of an intellectual type people. And they were like in government. And so he just knew that he had some stock that he could work with.
Teaching jobs were scarce and unstable. To find work, Frank traveled all over the South on foot. As he would settle into India, his dream of an all-black community.
I apologize for cutting you off. Okay. Now, when I said it bores me, it isn't because it isn't a history, it isn't a fairly decent history. The situation is that the narrative is incomplete. And you can go ahead and go to YouTube and watch it. Watch it after I tell you the dynamic story that I'm about to tell you. And one of the problems with that narrative you can see in the school system in New Mexico. Right now, UNM, Africana Studies, is attempting to departmentalize. It is 2019, and they started years ago before other departments got departmentalized. So you then go down to the South, and you go to New Mexico State, where I was an Aggie. I played football there. We'll get into my narrative later. And there's not a single Black professor in the history department. Frank Boyer, his gravesite, 15 miles south. There's not one Black professor in the history department at New Mexico State University. In fact, if you go into the College of Arts and Sciences, you won't. I won't get into it. But what you see here is this pie chart, right? And we'll get to this pie chart later. The pie chart of Black professors at New Mexico State doesn't even have a number because it's just a sliver. So if you want to understand why the history hasn't been told, it's because you don't have any Black people telling the story. They tell the story like this. And remember, this story that you see from them comes from a particular perspective. It was to talk about how New Mexico was receiving of everyone. It's a revisiting of history that wasn't. That's what that sounds like. Boyer had problems in the South, came to New Mexico, and he was good. He found the promised land. What did he say in there? He was Moses. That's good for the family narrative, but how can I benefit from that? I'm not Moses. So, I have a committee for my dissertation, and one of the professors, Dr. Shepard, he said, "Hey, why don't you do this thing on Blackton?" I watched that and I was like, that is not the kind of history I want to do. He's like, "No, just do it." So it took me 2 years to get into it. I got into it when I said, okay, I will do Blackdom if I can find somebody that reminds me of Compton. I'm originally from Compton, and if I can find somebody in Blackton that I could see in Compton, I will go ahead and write this dissertation about Blackton. You'll meet her later. Okay, so that's the pie chart. Look, look, no number. The pie chart says it all. Okay, so what I need you to do is to look under your seat. You get a car. No, I'm kidding. There's a census underneath your chair with a pin. Well, if you had to put your chair on the ground, it's probably not there. There may be some over there. Now, there should be 2 sheets of paper. Okay, one double-sided. This right here, though, if you get one, this is on the table. We are going to get into race stuff. So this is also your white privilege. To be able to say what you need to say, raise your hand, and then we have to address you. Okay, so when I talk about race doesn't exist, I'm trying to get us all to a place where we all can talk. Malcolm had this saying, you know, if we could all come to the table and not offend each other, we could just get out on the table what we really have to say, a lot of this stuff wouldn't be a problem. The table that we're trying to set today is, we're going to begin the conversation at race doesn't exist. Good? All right, so now while this video of Tim Wise is playing, I want you to take the census. It is on the front with, you should see it says #CensusUs. And oh, by the way, that hashtag you can use when you're on social media. When you're on social media to talk about this particular thing, if you're one of those kind of people who live tweets and all of that other. So, Tim Wise.
Because if you know the history of the whole concept of whiteness, if you know the history of the whole concept of the white race, where it came from and for what reason, you know that it was a trick, and it's worked brilliantly. See, prior to the mid to late 1600s in the colonies of what would become the United States, there was no such thing as the white race. Those of us of European descent did not refer to ourselves by that term, really ever before then. In fact, in the old countries of Europe, we had spent most of our time killing each other. We didn't love each other. We weren't one big happy family. The side of my family that comes from Scotland, hell, they didn't even worry about fighting people outside of Scotland. Highlanders and lowlanders just fought the hell out of each other. So there was no white race, but in the colonies of what would become the United States, what did we see in the 1660s, 1670s? We began to see that Africans of indentured servant status, many of them not enslaved yet, they were not necessarily permanently enslaved, some were, others were indentured like many poor Europeans for periods of 7 to 11 years. They could work off their indenture and then they would be free labor technically. Realized, as did the white indentured servants, the Europeans who hadn't even been called white yet, that they had a lot of things in common, like the fact that they were all getting their cut clean by the elite. And so they would get together, more than our history books taught us, to foment rebellion against the elite, to try to get a better deal for themselves on the basis of economic necessity and economic justice. And what did the elite do? When you see that you're outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants, you have to do one of two things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work? Rich folks weren't going to. They had to get poor people to work. The whole point was to be a person of leisure back in those days. That was the goal, was not to work. So you couldn't kill them all. You didn't want to kill them all. You had to do the work yourself. You had to build your own levee, build your own house. No, pick your own tobacco, harvest your own cotton. No, we're not going to do any of that. So you can't kill them, but you can co-opt them. And so the elite in Virginia, for example, in the colony, begins to give certain carrots to people of European descent, saying things like, you know, we're going to let you own a little land, not much, but just a little. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. Now you're free labor. And by the way, once you're free labor, you get 50 acres of land. Just because you're free labor, see. So we're going to cut you in on this deal. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And here's the best of all, we're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line, right? The idea was you're still going to get your clock clean. We still don't like you. We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination, but we're going to make you honorary members of this team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down. So they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions. Those rebellions began to stop almost instantly. Fast forward to the Civil War era, you have rich white folks in the South, where I come from, standing up and openly admitting that the reason they're prepared to secede from the Union, and the only reason they ever articulated publicly, ever, was to maintain and extend slavery and white supremacy not only where it already existed, but into the newly acquired, that is to say, stolen territories from Mexico to the west. That was what they said. Now we lie about it. We say it wasn't about slavery, but it was about states' rights. Yes, the right of the states to keep and maintain slaves, exactly.
So, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to go ahead and take your census. It's a part of the day. It's a part of the experience. There's a census on the go ahead and fill that out. Also on the back side, we're going to collect this later. Also on the back side is your information if you would like intersectionality training of this kind, where we begin the conversation with race doesn't exist, and we talk about the racialization of all of us. We are not our Bibles. If you look in is it the magazine? It's the magazine? Okay. The magazine has a really good article that includes a descendant from Blackdom who is a brilliant artist and a brilliant artist/architect is going to be talking to you tonight about the possibility of resurrecting Blackdom in a monument. He gonna get on. He gonna get y'all ready. All right, so you good? Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and move on. All right, so this is what you were looking at, the census. Can someone read this note here? Let me see if I get closer. Do I get closer? I do. Someone read this note.
Please answer both question 8 about Hispanic origin and question 9 about race. For this census, Hispanic origins are not races.
So, the government doesn't see the Latinx population as a race. What does that mean in New Mexico? What does that mean in El Paso? Okay, so part of my story includes being the racial justice director at the YWCA in El Paso. And what I did is the intersectionality training that I did a little bit more, but the intersectionality training that you're experiencing now. And what I found is that in a room of El Pasoans who are of the Latinx population, 99% of them will check the box. After this, what is there left? You're not a race. So now what do you have to choose from? You don't want to be treated like black folk. I'm sorry. And you definitely don't want to be treated like indigenous peoples. See, we're talking about blackdom, and when I begin the narrative about blackdom, I begin with the fact that it is on indigenous land. Because again, if I didn't, I would be perpetuating the notions of white supremacy and that indigenous peoples didn't exist. We just found it. You remember the, is the Schoolhouse Rock? Elbow room? Elbow. Come on, don't make me. Y'all gonna make me sing?
Yes.
Later. Okay. So, this is the census of what? 1920. Okay? Is there anything odd about it? This is the actual census now. Is there anything odd? Does anything stick out?
It's handwritten.
Awesome, huh? Right? It's handwritten, but what do you think this category is? We'll get to this later. I just want to get you ready for where we're going. Okay. There. Look a little closer. Here is where the line is. Can you read any of the last names here? Reyes. Anything else? Padilla. Okay. So what do you think was going on over here in 1920 in the census? We'll get to that.
They were changing something.
So we're talking about the racialization of the borderlands because if you were born in Juarez or El Paso, are you different? Are you different? You're Mexicano over here and you're Mexican over here? Them over there? That's what happens when you want a border. That's what a border means. It's them over there. And so that's what we talk about here. So I'm only giving you a preview. Again, it's for this part. Okay, so.
A native El Pasoan named David Dorado Romo has written an eye-opening popular history of El Paso, Juarez, titled Ringside Seat to a Revolution. As he says, it presents the history they never taught us in school. One chapter is about the Bath Riot.
January 28, 1917, it's 7:30 in the morning. Carmelita Torres, who is a 17-year-old Mexicana who is crossing the border every day from Juarez to El Paso to clean American homes, is stopped at the border by the U.S. Customs agent. And she is required to take a gasoline bath.
Before being allowed to cross, Mexicans had to bathe, strip nude for an inspection, undergo the lice treatment, and have their clothes treated in a steam dryer.
So that morning, Carmelita Torres refused. She gets the other 30 women in that electric trolley to get off the bus. Suddenly, other people start seeing what's going on. They go up and start protesting. And there's a huge riot.
The El Paso Morning Times bannered the story the next morning with this headline:
Auburn-haired Amazon at Santa Fe Street Bridge leads feminine outbreak. Juarez women incensed at the American quarantine regulations led a riot yesterday morning at the Santa Fe Bridge. Women ringleaders of the mob hurled stones at American civilians, both on the bridge and on the street.
The Mexican housekeepers who revolted had good cause to be upset. Inside the brick disinfectant building under the bridge, health personnel had been secretly photographing the women in the nude and posting the snapshots in a local cantina. What's more,
in 1917, Mexicanos who maintained little if any difference from the Mexicans who asserted U.S. citizenship rejected the dehumanization and false notions of inferiority projected upon them. Almost 100 years later, as the borderlands steer towards a more cohesive and just community, the project is fortified by the foundational knowledge that race doesn't exist.
Okay. So, we went from Tim Weiss saying that white people didn't exist to, and he was talking about Bacon's Rebellion, and 1676, when you had black workers, white workers, and indigenous peoples about to take over from the elites. And so they decided to divide and conquer. So they gave a little bit to the white workers, not a lot to keep them working, but just enough so that they wouldn't identify with the black folks who were getting treated worse. Now you see something where you have them over there. I'll give you an example. Let's say you are a Latina and you are going for your quinceañera. Now, you're from Juarez and you're from El Paso, or you're from Duranguito. Shout out to Duranguito. They're under attack, gentrification, whole story. Okay, so you didn't have to cross the border, you did have to cross the border. If you are the person in Juarez, you had your hair cut off. So, two people in front of a dressmaker, who's going to get the priority? Who is the one who's going to have certain ideas projected upon them? Probably the one with the hair that's cut. Because you can then assume certain things about that person that has their hair cut, right? That they went through the border check. Oh, they were also spreading fake news that there was typhus in Mexico. So now you have someone you think may have typhus in your dress shop asking you to size her up. So now you can create privilege. I'm privileged just because I'm on this side of the border, but not over here. And we in the same family. Racialization of the border. So this is a part of the intersectionality training, but the reason I do this is because when we're talking about blackdom, a lot of times it's reduced to we're talking about black folks. That's it. There's a whole nother world that they were engaging, and engaging in the way that they did allows us to move past what we're dealing with now. Okay, so all those people with unlimited access to their Wi-Fi, or please stand. We're going to do an exercise. Please stand. If you have internet and if you can get on it, cool. If not, we'll just talk about it. But right now, we're going to have you look for it because it's important. So I need these people looking for Spanish more, the definition of it. I need you two looking up Juan Garrido. And I need you all looking up the one drop rule. You have 60 seconds. Dun dun! Now I have a microphone. Is that okay? Can you hear me? It is? There we go. Okay, raise your hand if you got any of it. They're working on it over there. The definition of a Moor. Raise your hand if you got it. Okay. And one drop rule. Okay, so we're going to start on this side of the room. I'm not going to make you read a whole lot, just to give you the gist of what you found. Spanish Moor, go for it. Go ahead.
They were nomadic people from North Africa.
Stop! The Moors were nomadic peoples from northern Mexico. Northern Africa. Go ahead.
Originally, they were the inhabitants of Mauritania.
Got it. Go ahead. Yours is as good as mine.
They invaded Spain.
Stop! Next. What did you find? Anything else?
More in English usage is Moroccan.
Okay, stop. Which is what continent? Okay, go ahead. Now, anything else? Okay, cool. Y'all can sit down. All right, so let's go. Juan. Has anybody met Juan before? Juan is awesome. Go ahead. Kind of. Well, we'll get to that.
Juan was an African conquistador.
Okay, now let me stop at that point. I'm glad you stopped there. Okay, so to be clear, Black folks participated in the genocide of indigenous peoples as well. This is a complicated history, okay? Please.
He was born in the Kingdom of Congo.
Stop! Where, Congo? Oh, y'all know what that is, go ahead.
In 1480.
Continue.
He was Nwisi Congo or Congolese by birth.
Uh-huh. All right, stop. Now, find out where the document talks about him in Mexico. Oh, never mind. Do you have that part where he's in Mexico? Where is he in Mexico?
He joined a Spanish expedition and arrived in Santo Domingo in 1502.
So did we just talk about a Muslim who converted to Catholicism? That's the part you missed, but we'll get to that. Converted to Catholicism in 1490s, hitched a ride with who? The Portuguese? He hitched a ride with who? The Spanish?
He joined a Spanish expedition.
Spanish expedition. And then he settled in Mexico when?
He arrived in Santo Domingo in 1502.
Okay. What about 1520s? Anything there?
1519 invaded present-day Mexico.
Okay. Yeah, he was part of the genocide of indigenous. Continue. When did he get to Mexico?
1519.
What happened in 1520? The Mexican government gave him land. So, Spike Lee wears this beautiful sweatshirt, right, that has 1619 on it. We're talking about 1519 in Mexico, though. Black folks in Mexico. Yeah, you just thought about that, huh? Okay, let's go to the one-drop rule, y'all good. One-drop rule.
The one-drop rule is a social and legal.
Stop. Social and. Stop. Social and. Okay. So, continue. Sorry.
A racial classification that was historically prominent in the United States in the 20th century. It asserted that any person with either one ancestor of sub-Saharan African ancestry, one drop of black blood, is considered black, Negro in historical terms.
Okay. So, let's recap. This is the recap of the intersectionality. Black conquistadors were familiar with the genocide that they participated in. Were in Mexico 100 years before slaves, quote, were on the east coast of what we call the United States. Now, so, do you think that any of those black people who went to Mexico had babies? I'm just saying. The other thing is, when black people were in Spain, how long were they there? How many? 800 years. Did they have any babies? They did, right? So you had black people coming from Spain. That's why they could hitch a ride from Africa, because it was on the way. 100 years before. Get where we're going here. You have the remote. There we go. Gotta put it back there. Next.
Are Hispanic people white? Well, that depends on who you're talking to. There's a very confusing statistic about the percentage of white people in America, thanks to a clause in the US Census that refers to white non-Hispanic. Now, if you're white with European ancestry, Asian with Asian ancestry, or black with African ancestry, this may not be something you've ever even thought about. Let's look at the 2010 census. If you check the box that simply says white, this registers you as white non-Hispanic. which makes up 62% of the population. But together, white Hispanics and Latinos are 77% of the population. Now, if that seems like a quick way to boost the number of white people living in this country, that's because it kind of is. And if that also seems really confusing, that's because it is. So if you ever hear anyone say, "This is America, and 77% of it is white," whether they know it or not, they are in fact including a very large number of people who identify as Hispanic or Latino. If you look at the 2010 census application again, the difficulty is that Hispanic is not considered a race. The census asks you to choose your Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin, then choose your race between the 6 categories offered. Not only is this a hell of a shock when you consider that over 55 million US citizens are Hispanic, but I guess the some other race category is supposed to be a passive-aggressive catch-all for their beautifully diverse culture? And even that option doesn't really work. According to the US Census Bureau, most people who mark some other race are often counted as white. So if Hispanic isn't a race, then what is it? Well, before we get to that, we actually have to settle another important thing. What's the difference between Hispanic and Latino? So I'm gonna enlist some help from my friend, Kat Lasso.
Thanks for having me, Francesca. So it may get a little confusing if this is your first time hearing this, so I'll try to keep it as simple as I can. Hispanic refers to people of Spanish-speaking origin. It means you have a family history in a Spanish-speaking country. This means you have origins in these countries, including Spain. But notice how Brazil isn't included in the map? Well, that's because they don't primarily speak Spanish. They speak Portuguese. Which brings us to Latino, or Latinx if you want to be gender inclusive, which you should be. Latinx refers to having origins in Latin America, which is basically the countries in North and South America that are geographically south of the United States, including most of the Caribbean. And unlike Hispanic, Latinx excludes much of Latin America's colonizer, Spain. So, one more time, Hispanic refers to language, and Latinx focuses on geographic location. But whichever term you use, neither of them actually refer to racial identity. Just like America, Latin America has a long and complex history that intersects between Native people, European colonization, African slavery, and global immigration patterns. Which is why there are white Latinos, Native Latinos, Black Latinos, Asian Latinos, and every kind of mixture that you can think of. Does that help?
Yeah, that does help. But I think part of the problem we're dealing with here is the broader confusion between ethnicity and race. As we've covered, race is not biologically real. It's basically an ever-shifting categorization that sometimes includes ethnicity and sometimes doesn't. But when it comes to ethnicity, there are legitimate differences between groups of people that aren't based on external characteristics. And yes, ethnicity can be fuzzy, but there are cultural practices you can associate with it, like language, cultural values, and traditions. Which is why if an Argentinian couple adopts a baby from China, that baby will most likely grow up speaking Spanish and rooting for Lionel Messi. The simple answer? Race doesn't exist, but ethnicity does.
Exactly. The reason this gets so confusing when we're talking about Latinx in America is that there's a broad ethnic Latinx identity that has a complex history with lots of different racial groups living together. Latinx isn't a race, but we're definitely racialized as a people, which is confusing, and I'm the one who said it. The US and Latin American media has done a great job at constructing an image of what Latinx look like, and that image is rarely Black or fully indigenous, for example. We, like the rest of the world, have internalized these messages of white supremacy through the media. Based on the census, in a predominantly Black and white binary society, many of us default to white. I personally identify as a mixed race Latina with indigenous ancestry, but that's just me. There are a multitude of ways that Latinx choose to identify racially, but it's up to us to unlearn much of what we've been taught about race and demand better and more accurate forms of representation.
Damn! There has to be a better way to talk about this. Well, there is a better way. The census is planning to make changes in 2020 in one huge way. They're going to stop using the word race altogether. Hispanic, Latino, and Spanish origin will be a category like everything else with no qualifiers. That means people will now check the categories that best describe them. This will not only give us a better idea of how many people identify as Hispanic or Latino, but could also give us a better idea of multiracial and multi-ethnic numbers. So to return to the original question, are Hispanic or Latino people white? Well, some are and some aren't. But to quote the 2013 Census Bureau report, race and ethnicity are not quantifiable values. Rather, identity is a complex mix of one's family and social environment, historical or socio-political constructs, personal experience, context, and many other immeasurable factors. Surprisingly woke coming from the census. Special thanks to my friend Kat Lasso. Tell us where we can find you online.
You can check out my work at MeToo or my personal channel, The Cat's Meow.
We'll put links in the description box. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time right here on Decoded.
Okay, so let's all stand.
Hi, today we're here learning how to play.
You go ahead and go forward. Go forward on that. All right, so shake it off a little bit. All right. Now we talked a lot about race. It probably triggered a little bit. Okay. So I'm gonna hum a tune, and I just want you to hum with me. All right. You ready to go? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Bah! We good. Let's go. You can go ahead and have a seat. All right, next part. Okay, now we're talking about black people. Does anyone know who this is? This is Frank Boyer, the person that they were talking about in the other video. This is him in his glory. I don't know how old he is. He's older. Next, I'm just going to point, okay? So, often, she is left out. Does anyone know who she is? This is Ella Boyer. These are the pillars of black. Now, in my history, I don't talk about them as much because the family has preserved their history so well. I knew that was going to happen. That's fine. Always when you get to the black people, right? No. So Frank and Ella are mythologized. What I do is I demythologize and I make them more complicated. How I complicate them has to do with what I was going to show you. Their grave site is between New Mexico State and UTEP. Does anybody know where UTEP is? Raise your hand. It's El Paso, Texas. You flew out of there probably to get a cheaper ticket or something. And then you have NMSU, which is about 45 minutes away. So I lived in Las Cruces and I used to travel back and forth. I had no idea that his gravesite was there, so I started going to his gravesite on my route when I was going back and forth, writing my dissertation, trying to get some inspiration. I would walk through the cemetery, but then there was one time, and if you go to my Instagram, you'll see it, and you're gonna be scared too, and you're not getting out your car either. It was a really foggy day. I'm not kidding. It was a really foggy day. You know how it can get really foggy to where you really can't see? But this was on the day that I was supposed to go to the cemetery. So I go and I have to stop at this diner. I have to stop at this diner that's right off of I-10. It used to be, well, it's a diner there that's still there, okay? And I had to get up my courage because I'm about to go to a gravesite and I can barely see 5 feet in front of me. So I drive up to it. I'm like, I'm not scared. I'm good. I feel confident. So I drove up, and then I was like, nah, that's all right. I'm just going to drive around. So I just drove around the cemetery, but you could see the cemetery and the problems I had. Do you have to come up here? Okay, go ahead. Come up here. You good. You good. I keep talking about black people forever. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to Mitty right now while that's loading. Mitty, I found her. Okay, so this is how I found her. She was on trial for attempted murder of her fiance in 1917. Yeah. A black woman. Okay, we'll get to that. Okay, so this is what I was talking about, cemetery, and it'll come up, but you can see it. And this is where it is. So then you have NMSU up there, I-10, and then down here you have El Paso. Next. But I want you to notice this part. The intersectionality of it all. In this, you have Juarez, Paso, Anthony, Sunland Park. That's what our border is. It's all connected. It's just there are different influences, and Texas has a lot of it. There it is again, Frank. Let's see it again. Next. This is how I begin. I use part of their narrative.
A small town once lived here, in the wide open spaces of opportunity. Each passing season, more people came here to settle. Dreams were possible. It was a place of freedom. Begun in the early 1900s, this pioneer town was different than most built in the West.
All right, that's about as much as I could get through the other film. That's about as much history of Blackton is, because see, there's a lot of Ayers family, of Boyer, but of Blackton itself, it isn't. It's talking about an era, and it's presenting a narrative, and then they stick Blackton into it. Has anybody watched Godless? Godless on Netflix. I'm not going to give it away, but what they do at the end is what happens to Blackton all the time. Blackton becomes a footnote or a prop for some other narrative. So that's how you see that. But I do like Godless. It's a really good thing. Next. So this is the 1910 census. This is the Boyer family. Now, if you see there are all of these kids, yet we don't know anything about Ella. Now this is 1910. Have a baby today as a black woman. Try to have a baby today as a black woman. How hard is it? Go back 100 years. Ella was a midwife. All of the people who came in, she took care of them. She made sure that if they were having a baby, it was all good. She was also a college grad. She was also a Freemason.
Wow.
We'll get to that later. Next. This is what I need you to read, because if you go back and you look at that other narrative that is out there, it says that Boyer was scared, ran away from the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia, ran from the Ku Klux Klan because he saw somebody get nicked. His father told him to go to the West, get out of here, the Ku Klux Klan is after you. What did Boyer say? This is an article in 1947, and that's Boyer's words. So it kind of takes away from the other narrative when the guy says, well, there was a lynching in the county that I was in. So why is it there? Because there was a natural narrative flow that you had for black people coming from the South. What they don't tell you is that they came here because it was about ambition instead of fear all the time. This is from earlier, okay? So I pulled out a part so you can see. This says Mexican underneath. They wrote a W over the Mexican. That's how you create white Mexicans. You just write over the part where they wrote. 1920. When was Carmelita Torres? 1917. Racialization of the border. It has to go through institutions. It has to go through a process so that people will accept the power of others. These are just some pictures. So, one more. So MIDI was the antithesis of what blackdom was meant to be. Shh. This is an article. Yeah. Right? Now, does anybody know when we got into World War I? 1917. She became the antithesis of patriotism. So they tried to clean up the streets. Let me give you an example. By the time 1917 came, she had already had a court case before the Supreme Court of New Mexico for prostitution. By 1915. How do you think the elite black folks who were educated, black ministers, black military men, black Freemasons, and blackdom itself, MIDI represented the person they probably wanted this similar thing. So how vulnerable was she? How vulnerable was this particular black woman 100 years ago? Now, if you don't understand Roswell, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, and then we're going to get to Roswell. Roswell is where you want to be. She ran her empire from 201 South Virginia Street. She was a gunslinger. She was a bootlegger. And yes, she was a madam. She was also of another name when she was in blackdom. She was Mattie Moore. And she was a part of getting the first 40 acres of blackdom. However, while they were going through a court case to get the 40 acres, somehow she was MIDI in Roswell. So remember, that's about a 15-mile distance between blackdom and Roswell. She went to Roswell and became MIDI. She was famous because she knew that the court was her theater. And she did her thing. She became infamous in 1917. By 1919, nobody cared because she had more land than anybody else, and they were about to start an oil company. We'll get to that. Next. So, this is blackdom, though. The Articles of Incorporation. We're going to go through it quickly. I'm going to have some people read, so be ready. Go, next. Now, I want you to notice, Boyer is here. Sorry. And there's a whole lot of other people there. So it wasn't just one Moses. There were a few families that started blackdom in 1903. Next. Townsite Company to build a town. I'm skipping through it so you know. Now, you're going to build this grand scheme. And if you were running from white people or you were afraid of being murdered because you are a black person in 1903, would you then turn around and name the place that you're going to build all this stuff Blackdom? I don't think that they were afraid of white people. There was also a black military there. We know them as the Buffalo Soldiers. So what you saw, not just in Blackdom, but in the 200 or so other black enclaves and towns, where they had black ministers, black Freemasons, and black military men, the colony usually survived. That's why I call the Blackdom Illuminati. But you can see they had grand plans. They eventually did have a seminary too. some of these men that signed, where is he? I can't see him right now. You go from being a maid, a domestic, a porter, a servant, to being a stockholder when you went to Blackton. Y'all can read later. I'll post it on the event part, and you can read this stuff. I'm trying to get to them. Good. Okay. That's them two, facing off. Okay. So, eventually, this becomes 40 acres of black. Platted, focused. It's impressive. I won't explain it though. I'm going to give you an expert on the lines. The depth of what they did is beyond what is being taught because, again, like I told you in the beginning, there's not any black professors that are focused on this history of New Mexico. So now, get ready for the next level. Next up, the great. I don't want to do that. I don't want to embarrass him.
Hello, everyone. That was just as enlightening for me when I first met Timothy. Shared just levels of history that when I did my thesis, it just wasn't there. And so he brought another level of knowledge to this, but I think that one of the things I do want to express is that, okay, so this was, from an architectural standpoint, sort of a gold mine. And it was the only thing initially that I had to sort of work with as a place to begin from. And so this plat became sort of a statement about the history of America, because this was your typical sort of what's called a frontier town's square. So if you can imagine, you can build a wall around this as you sort of territorialize land, Native American land, or when the colonizers first came here, this was the method for colonizing the land, is that the public square typically held sort of the government sort of aspect of the business, of the city, of the town square, and then they build a wall around it. And then as they conquered more and more land, then they could take the walls down and extend these streets. And so you see this in most cities, particularly cities like Virginia and those early colonization towns. I chose a strategy of using this plat, this 40-acre plat, to navigate a story and create a narrative about Blackton.
Yeah. Okay. And let's just go. You can tell me if you're moving and then I'll stop.
Yeah, why don't you keep moving? So one of the things that I started out with as far as my thesis went was that that the line itself was a very powerful statement, and the color line, in fact, was a very powerful statement. And although I don't think that black folks were afraid of whites in Blackton, I do think that there was an unspoken narrative of a color line, and I think it's a expressed by the fact that Blackton's here and Roswell's there, and there was very little in between, and very little water access. So water is, this map doesn't convey the blue and the red, but there was no water. And if you ever go out to Blackton, you can see that it's pretty desolate. I mean, it's a tough place to live. There's just no mistake about it. So when I first went out there in 2001, the only thing that was there remaining was the raised foundation, which I think the church itself was on. And then there was a diagonal road that cut across what was the town square that you saw prior. So the town was actually never built, and you know, the lots are still there, there's still boundaries, and there are some people that own that land, but there's actually nothing built there. So what I did is I used this as a sort of to set up. I took Francis Boyer's impulse, his utopian impulse, and I sort of spanned it across the entire African American history. And so the way that this map was laid out, I was able to create first, second, third, fourth migration in actually the way that the United States is sort of organized. So that the first migration was on the north, the second migration of African Americans was in the south. The third migration was actually in Kansas City as well. Kansas City actually engulfed most of the Black Americans, African Americans that migrated to these regions that were, they wanted to territorialize these areas quickly because the land was taken from Native Americans, and so the quickest way to get land is let people occupy it so that there's no longer a history and that land gets occupied. So that land was being given away by the United States to different African Americans, white Americans, anyone who wanted to travel west and acquire land, you could get 40 acres. So what I did is I started to see that actually African Americans had no access to the public square. They really didn't have any access to the public square or, you know, a voice in the public dialogue until, as I see it, the fourth migration. I see the third migration, and I didn't have that narrative that they had struck oil. Although I think that they struck oil, and the narrative was so hidden that there was still a problem about accessing, you know, just public knowledge and being able to give your voice there. So these lines here sort of represent the walls, which are in fact the color line that keep African Americans outside of the voice of social dynamic. And I wanted to give these sort of thematic narratives. So I looked at the first migration as the spectacle of slavery. And the second migration I looked at as the memory of the spectacle of slavery. And the third migration as the experience of the memory of the spectacle of slavery. And then the fourth migration, which, you know, kind of aligns with a lot of the Black Power movements, was the identity of the experience of the memory of the spectacle. And so with that, I created on this memorial monuments, and I really thought about music because it's the soul of Black folks, as Du Bois says. So each one of these areas represents, has a monument that sort of represents each one of those thematics. And here you can just see, I did what was called a sort of I did a study, and I started looking at what I felt was actually happening in terms of these lots. And I kind of started imagining the lots as a person, each lot as an identity itself, and then this wall that starts to separate them. So this is sort of a graphic interpretation by me that starts to tell a story, and as you can see, music plays a big role, but for me anyway in this. And so, and then also realizing that the soul has its own source, and so water is really never separated from any of the migrations completely because the soul is self-sustaining. And so this was my first sort of graphic attempt at conveying, and I'm not going to go through each one of these migrations, but I wanted to go through the first migration at least. And so this is a way of conveying this spectacle of slavery. And so I set up a block area that represents sort of slaves being sold on the block. And then the water starts, which again is separated from the public square, but there is still water in these areas. And then I sort of imagined how musically, but how these people were caught in the production of slavery and caught in the line. And so those were the house slaves themselves that actually had marginal, and they're closer to that public square marginally than the field slaves that are far removed from being able to have any voice whatsoever. I also tried to create an idea of the Underground Railroad that has an exit from, you know, this sort of fixed condition. I guess I did have these in here. So the second migration was, I principally, you know, I'm not going to go all over it again, but again, the Underground Railroad, you can see that the house slaves are still caught in this sort of line, production line. There's still absolutely no access to the public square. And so the third migration, which kind of it represents Blackdom itself, I also see it as the consciousness is part slave, part free, and you know, you had free hands, but the walls were still there, and there is some sort of, I'd say, buffering into the public square, but it's like Blackdom itself. You know, you're 20 miles out. And the fourth migration, which is interesting for me because I grew up in Chicago, and my parents migrated actually from Alabama to Chicago, so large degree of people from the South. And actually, as far as my family goes, we were kind of not, I wouldn't say privileged, but we weren't, like, my grandfather was kind of a bank. And so we were okay. And we would go down south actually in the summer, myself, and we would think of it as summer camp because we were on so much land. And I guess a civil rights lawyer was our neighbor, and he had thousands and thousands of acres. And so, I mean, it was just like being at summer camp. But little did we know, you know, that Montgomery, Alabama, which was 30 miles away, Martin Luther King was getting watered down. So it's amazing how you can be sheltered. And then so I just combined all of these different, and my thesis was called Multiple Migrations. At that time, I wanted it to be more of a museum than a memorial and during my thesis, so I didn't try and define it. I was just trying to create a design strategy as far as my thesis goes to later create a museum And then, this is this combination of all of 4 of them, and it's almost like a weaving, but I don't know if you can notice or not, but there's sort of a musical piano-like quality to the drawing itself. And I wanted to try and convey that sort of musicality. And so then what happened was pretty phenomenal. I had sort of set this project off to the side. It was 2001 when I did my thesis, and then in 2007, I was looking in the paper. No, I wasn't actually. I bumped into a guy who said, you know, I saw something about Roswell wanting to do a memorial. And I looked in, found out about it, and connected with the foundation, the Blackfoot Foundation down in Roswell. And they were in the process of doing this memorial. It was just your standard memorial with water and, you know, floral stuff going on. And they saw my thesis, and they sort of pushed that off to the side and took on this project. But initially, when the project was granted, the project was located in downtown Roswell, just right next to the Wool Bowl, NEMI, Anderson Museum. I mean, it was right in the heart of downtown. I think it was 6 or 7 acres. Yeah. So there's the Wool Bowl, Anderson Museum, and the property itself that we had is right here. So it was an ideal location. So I came up with a circulation plan, part of a master planning project that showed that orange just kind of shows how this project can start to connect to downtown Main Street. And I took circulation patterns that start to, this is the project itself, right? So circulation patterns that were already existing around the site and imprinted them into the site as well. Initially there were 4 phases, so dreams come true, I guess, at that time. So phase 2 was the museum, phase 1 was obviously the memorial, and then phase 3 was a info archive center. And from there, I moved into finally starting to actually create schematics, renderings on SketchUp of what this thing could possibly start to look like inside of this space. And so these are different shots of the memorial, and just massing models of the museums themselves. But as you can see, back up one, yeah. As you can see, there's this initial path, and you're never, with the first migration, you have these walls that actually you don't even have a view of the public square, and all you're hearing is this beautiful water, and you know, you can't get any of it, you know? So that was the idea of just like presenting something that the gardens that is as this beautiful thing, and if you can imagine being a field slave, where you know, you're out there and you're seeing all this beautiful plantation, yet none of it is yours, and yet you go back to this, you know, your slave shack. And so that was the feeling I wanted to convey, a certain beauty that you had no access to. But I also wanted to convey, if you could back up one, yeah. I also wanted to try and convey, and water becomes a big source here. So even in the most horrific sort of spectacle where, you know, slaves are being sold, on the back side of that is, has anyone been to Millennium Park in Chicago? Yeah, so I wanted to have that feeling of of kind of joy and where kids want to be and all of that. And so growing up in Chicago, I saw Millennium Park, and I was just blown away by the towers where the water comes down, and the kids are just always there. It's just packed all the time. And so I wanted that sort of feeling to be there, of this sort of renunciation. Yes, you're being educated, you're seeing these things, but you're also experiencing joy at the same time. So this water runs down continuously and creates a pond around it itself, and it also is sort of endemic of the Middle Passage and traveling through water and that whole thing. And there's imagery and that sort of thing. And so there's water, also these waterfalls, and each one of these where the field slaves are. And these are not raised, they're actually 6 feet under, because field slaves are just thought of as a product that once they die, they're dead. And so there was I come from a performance art background, so I wanted to sort of include music, voice, visuals, video, and that whole thing. And I always had wanted to saw this as becoming artist participatory. So that artists who were studying about Blackdom could in fact infuse their language inside of the video on the back wall, or a visual, audio artist, a music artist, could have voices coming out of those 6 feet under holes where the plats were. So you can see that as you move in closer, you can get a little bit better visuals of the walls and how they, in one sense, are very beautiful, but on another level, they definitely do their role of creating boundaries. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. One of the things that happened was in 2008 or 2009, the project got suspended because the state lost funding for the project. So right now what we are is if you can grab the magazine on your way out. It's Return to Blackdom. We are in the process of trying to find a place for this intersectionality to happen, and also a place for artists to further educate about intersectionality of Blackdom. And again, Blackdom is a consciousness that extends. It's a utopian consciousness that extends beyond just Blackdom. And so it's overlapping, and we are establishing a team of very talented people to start moving this project forward so that we can create an infrastructure that can be there for this continued talks on intersectionality. I want to thank you for being here. Thanks a lot.
So I need to add that because without Gregory, I would not have thought of the true intellectualism that happened within Blackdom. So I'm writing my dissertation, and I run across the monument, and I'm like, oh, I need to get to know who's doing that. And so that's when I started a conversation with him, but I never got a chance to really talk to him about Blackdom until I actually came to northern New Mexico, which was very recent, and so it's good that things are moving. Okay, so now I'm gonna give you a quick history of Blackdom the way that I teach it. Now, I know you've been sitting there for a while, so let's real quick, stand up real quick, shake it off. All right, Muhammad Tune, you ready? 1, 2, 3. All right, we good. Okay, so So, I call myself a Blacktamite, and I'm going to present to you Afrofuturism as it is connected to Blackdom. Okay. All right, next. We're going to go through this briefly. All right, so I put their whole timeline just in what's in the public record, because what ends up happening is when I start talking about Blackdom, people say, but do they have a history? Well, what is the evidence for this? So I'm about to give you the evidence for all the things that I just told you. Next. Next. See how long it goes? This is 1947. This is the article with Boyer over here. Next. All right, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Is anybody familiar with that newspaper? All right, so you can go there yourself and look at these articles. Go ahead. See that? That's what it looks like. This is the front page. And what you see here, the Blackdom town site. So yes, it existed. Next. All right, now, this is somebody writing about Blackdom. This is the actual words. 1903. Pumping. We're talking about water. We're talking about water. We're talking about rail lines. We're talking about black people taking advantage of the economic boom that is happening in southeastern New Mexico in 1903. This is what they sent out across the country. Ohio, Indiana, Texas, Oakland. Well, Oakland wasn't invented at that time. Next. You see what homestead proof looks like. This was the first one that was truly of the Boyer family. There were two others. We'll get into that later. You can see it on my Instagram. If you go to it, I have all of that kind of history there. I'm going to run through it, but I promise you all that history is on my Instagram or Facebook or something like that. Okay, next. John Boyer. You can read all this. It's a lot of stuff. Go ahead. Who's the president? Pretty cool. I just love that part. Okay, go ahead. So this is what those lines look like. This is what he was Gregory was talking about. This is the 40 acres, but you could see how they plotted over here. So this is a township. This is as far as breaking it down. You see this road? 285. Somebody know where 285 is in Santa Fe? It'll take you straight there.
It's a long drive.
It's a long drive. Especially in New Mexico now.
But it is one time. All you do is get on.
Y'all know how it goes. But look at all these people. Look at all these people jumping in on it because they know that something is going down and they want a piece of it. Think of it like this. You know how, I don't know about you, but I'm from Compton, so everybody has a record label. Getting a town was like getting a record label today. We'll go into that. Go next. All right, so you got Dexter, you got the river. What river is that? I'm testing you right now. Ah, look at you. Okay. There's the town site. Well, it's really not there. It's actually right here. I kind of messed up on that. That was when I was young and Facebook, Instagram, those places we're starting to build a digital, virtual Blackdom so all of us can participate in that particular intersectionality. We can, in fact, you can go to it now and like it. This is where I also put out the history of Blackdom. Next. Ezel Ragsdale. Remember I told you about Nikisha Breeze? This is her family member. This is his homestead proof. Thanks. 40 acres. Love Street. I'll show you this real quick. Okay, so you got 1903 Blackton, right? Where it's just like, oh, it's a refuge. All right, cool. Everybody can come. We good. Come as you are. Down here, they're like, nah, we want farmers. None of that other stuff. Yeah, nah. You can come. Nah, you don't live on a farm. Why? It wasn't just about the scheme anymore. It was a whole nother level of Blackton that they were creating. Go ahead. This is what happens with Blackton. This is how Blackton becomes the actual land because of the 1909 Homestead Extension. They went from giving out 160 acres of desert land to giving out 320 acres. This is when Mitty got involved. She owned a whole square mile. This madam, this bootlegger, this everything that is the antithesis of Blackton, owned a whole square mile. Next. And this kind of talks about it, 1911. Amends its charter. This is where they take off the 13 founders and they put 3. It was Ella, Frank, and one other person I can't remember right now. You can see 1911. This is what they did. That's what it sounds like. Next. This is my most favorite part, so listen closely. Next. December 1911. Negro Thanksgiving. When I first read the title, I thought, chitlins. Cornbread, greens. Watch this. Next. Oh, hold on. Go back. Read this part. Someone.
Francis Boyer was the toastmaster of the evening. Toasts were responded to by the following gentlemen. Immigration, W.M. Young. Our school, James Eubanks.
Next.
What we produce, Daniel G. Keys. Music, real estate, W.T. Williams. Pumping and windmills, Clinton Ragsdale. Possibilities in livestock, George Wilson. Music, business opportunities, G. W. Wilson. Homesteading, Monroe Collins.
That was 1911. What happened in 1912? In New Mexico? Anything?
Statehood.
Okay, so why do you think that they were organizing this thing and getting you to know of it? Because all of a sudden, Roswell, the people in control of Roswell were going to be in control of the whole county Chavez. And they knew that the Confederates were coming for them. Does anybody know of the New Mexico Military Institute? Does anybody know how it was started? By ex-Confederates. Roswell, Little Texas, was a Confederate stronghold during this time period. So, when it was a territory, there was no Jim Crow laws. Yeah. Soon as you get statehood, you can get Jim Crow laws. They knew that. They also knew if we owned our own town, they lived a dual life. A lot of us talk about Du Bois and the veil, the double consciousness. Their double consciousness was literally how they lived. In Blackdom, in Roswell, in Dexter, in Artesia during the time, Artesia, right? That I told you, Artesia did not like Blackdom. I can tell you stories about that later. The Dixie Choir, I just love that. They had, like, you could tell that these people were proud of what they were doing, and not only that, they were doing it in a particular manner that some of you may recognize. These were Freemasons, educated folk. And this is what it looked like even in the paper in 1911. Next. This is what the paper looks like in 1912. In Kansas. Why are we talking about blackdom and Kansas? Part of it is I just want you to see that China and Russia is still in the news 100 years ago. So, you know what I mean? We'll get to that. Next. All right, so this is more of the paper. Next part. Okay. Colonize Negroes, a whole nother story. See, New Mexico wasn't the only place that this story was being told. You have Guthrie, Oklahoma. That's where this article came from, and it went to Kansas. So there was an actual Twitter. Their story went viral 100 years ago, is my point. Next. The Crisis magazine. Does anybody know the editor and who's mostly known for who? There you go, Du Bois. I was just talking about the double conscious, right? This is his magazine. Well, he's the editor, long story, but it's known for him. Look what you see on the front. 1913, you see it right there? Black folks. Next. No Jim Crow laws. Next. 1915. How important was church to their revolution? The church was the way that you were actually going to get in the paper. They understood media. They promoted themselves that way as dignified folk. So when you have somebody like Minnie coming in, you got to back away from her, even though she's black. Well, next. 1917 is an important time. I told you about 1917. Entered war. Next. Next. I showed you the young man Ezel had a homestead, but blackdom was big enough to where he got drafted from blackdom. That is his draft number. And you can see there were other draft numbers in the county. So you had black people being drafted from blackdom, and we still don't know this story. Next. Oh, there's more. Next. Now, I show this because I talk about Ella, but I don't give her enough time. This is the 1947 article with Frank Boyer, but this is talking about Ella. The key part, Negro order. Next. And then you have MIDI. Anyone want to read it?
Midi Moore captured. The present city administration, carrying out its program inaugurated some time ago for a better and cleaner Roswell, yesterday caused the arrest of Mittie Moore, a colored woman living on South Virginia Avenue, charging her with prostitution. She was arraigned before Judge Parsons yesterday afternoon and entered a plea of guilty, at which time her case was set for hearing at 3 o'clock this afternoon.
1917, she seemed like she was in really big trouble. Next. This is also Dixie. I just want someone to read this part.
Dixie explained to the court that she was convinced that Bruce needed a gripping and
This is a black woman who hung out with Mitty. So Mitty had road dogs.
Road dogs.
Dixie Porter, a colored woman, South Virginia. See, South Virginia became a way to identify that she rolled with Mitty. That's how infamous Mitty was in Roswell. This is just, I mean, imagine a black woman who's like, nah, he needed a whooping, and I gave his punk. Anyway, I'm quite sure they cleaned up her language. I'm quite sure. But this is what I want you to notice, though. Ella, what does she do in opposition to the image of Mitty?
She leads a group of people who crochets and hospital mock calls.
She sits in a window on Main Street, sewing together, along with a group of other women, military wives, military families, including the colonel's wife. So you have black and white coming together as patriots in Roswell. Understand that Ella was strategic. They could have sold them out and blacked them and then presented them. They did it out in a storefront window when you go to Macy's in New York. I've never been to New York, but I hear it's cool. Next. None of that mattered in 1919. Nobody cared what was going on with Mitty in 1919. We'll pull acreage. More acreage, more money. She owns a whole school. Acres for an oil company in New Mexico, run by black people. Roswell Daily Record. Next. 1920. You can't really see it, but trust me. Next. New test, deep test. Here's more evidence. I'm just going to give you the evidence, and then we'll talk about the narrative later. Question and answer. Next. Drilling company, exploration, where is it coming from? California. You see, there's a whole network being built around Blackdom and the infrastructure of Blackdom. Banks are now coming to Blackdom. You have people from all around the country trying oil and in southeastern New Mexico, where Blackdom has a company that people can lease the land from. 1920. Heard of Blackdom Oil Company. So you are special. Next. 22. Next. Now, they sold their church in 21. Why would black people sell their church? So you can't burn it down. See, people thought that black people sold their church. Another one. Keep going. Keep going. Thought they sold their church because the town had fallen on hard times. The complete opposite happened. But then you had southeastern New Mexico rising. The lecture will, But the Ku Klux Klan was, they didn't really stop the train because these black folks were more strategic than you might imagine. If you sell your church, you can't burn it down. If we're in this virtual situation where we're all on our different homesteads, you can't take us all out. And then also some of us live in Roswell, have a homestead in Blackdom, and we only go to the town Juneteenth when we want to, for some families. Other families stay there, very few. This is 1926. If you read any other article, Blackdom was supposed to be gone by now. Next. I just want you to know, like I said, I had to find people that I could find in Compton. So when I found this article, I was like,
Here it is.
yes. Along with Mitty, there are other people. I can show you shootouts that happened on Main Street in Roswell between black folks. I mean, it was a dispute. We didn't have one. So this is one of those, but this is another Warriors. Now, remember in the video in the beginning, it's a long, long time ago now, we're almost done. This is Boyer's father. The one that they said was a Wagoneer and who never made it to Blackdom or New Mexico. He did make it and died in Roswell. You can see his history. He was enslaved. The other way. Oh, wait, stop. Native born American, white. Resident of, so if they say the Klan never came to New Mexico, they lie. 1928, we're still talking about Blackdom. Remember they said it was gone. Next. What does that say? Read it, somebody. Not all of it, just read it until you get tired. Go ahead. Stop. You get the point. They have been pumping oil and exploring for at least a decade. 1930, they're still talking about oil in Blackdom. What happened in 1929 to the world? And they're still talking about oil in Blackdom. So, with the complexity of Blackdom, I'd really like to open up the floor to questions. I know you've been through a lot tonight. Do we need to stretch? Let's do that. Everyone please stand. Let's shake it off. You got a mic for the questions? Over there. I think you have the first one? All right, you got the mic first. Just raise your hand, we'll pass the mic to you. If you want to go, please do.
All right.
This is the time.
It's a bit of a long question, but after the question, I will be quiet and let you answer.
Okay.
I've seen your presentation twice now because I watched the video. And here is my primary question. If you were going to summarize your thesis in 4 sentences, say 3, but I'll give you 4, what would it be? It almost seems to me we started with whiteness in this construction, which I completely agree with. I want to emphasize that. I believe in the construction of whiteness and that race doesn't exist, so racism does. I'm missing the tie into how we get from this, what is blackness? That almost seemed like a separate presentation, and there were so many issues we needed to go into in more depth in there that it almost seemed to need to be a separate presentation.
It is.
There was a lot.
Indeed.
After this other comment, I'll shut up and let you respond, but I would encourage you to narrow your thesis. If I were a book editor, I would say narrow your thesis down to 4 sentences. The second comment is, even with race doesn't exist, how exactly it seems that's very important to you, which is fine. But on the other hand, you're dealing with Blackdom in 1903. It's much easier for us to say that than for them to say that. Because at that time you have Jim Crow laws, race is enshrined in law. And then at the end we get various references to Twitter and Facebook
and I'm sorry, at certain points I start to feel we're reaching a little bit.
Okay.
Because of virtual community. Now,
I feel you.
that's my antipathy.
Now, I'll explain the first part first. Why did we start with race doesn't exist first? Okay. So, I begin with that because we need all of us to come to the table. There's a lot of issues that are rising up, bubbling up, that were under the table. Now we have a chance to talk about it. But it isn't until we first acknowledge that race doesn't exist, but racism does. Then we can have a conversation. Now, we first have to talk about race if we're going to say that it doesn't exist. We have to say what it means. We have to define it. That's why we start there. And I'm just going to say, not because you're black, but you came late. You know what I mean? And I explained that I was giving 2 presentations. I'm just saying. I'm giving 2 presentations in one because of the crowd that we were with. See, if I was just here giving the history of blackdom, we would lose the point of the blackdomites. They did not see themselves through the lens of race. Other people did. So in my thesis, I would reduce it to 7 words. Black people never needed white people. Period. That is my thesis. But I have to explain what white people need, which is that race doesn't exist, but racism does. So the people who claim that they are white and follow a white supremacist identity, ideal. What was your second question? How did we get to Twitter? Because I'm also trying to introduce you to how this intersectionality can happen in a real world. Even though it's virtual, none of us can all sit in the same square and go through the same training and understand race. I mean, there's so Latinx. Raise your hand if you know what the definition of Latinx is. See what I'm saying? See what I'm saying? So we all can't be in the same space, but we can virtually. So that's where it comes from. That was a part of the beginning. Any other questions? Comments?
What made you even get here?
Oh, I'm from Compton, and I didn't understand what blackdom had to do with Compton.
Where do you find the word?
What do you mean?
Where does blackdom come into your consciousness?
That's what they called it.
No, I mean, how do you even know to look at it? Where's the
Oh, so I was in graduate school. You mean like that? Where did it come? Okay, so I was in graduate school, and I had to pick my dissertation topic. And this is a really big thing that happens, during your PhD. And so I wanted to do something cool because of the nature of borderland studies. It's an intersectionality-based, curriculum. It's borderland studies. So, but it's ethnic studies at the same time. So I was able to use the history of black non-Hispanics in a borderland setting. So that's what created the atmosphere for the thesis. What brought me to it was one of my dissertation committee people who became my chair when my chair passed away. He said, hey, you really should do this blackdom thing. Now, I didn't know he was telling me to do it. I thought he was suggesting it. But when we looked at the budget that I had, which was like -24, and, Wells Fargo was like, nah, you can't do that anymore. So blackdom was closer, so I decided that I would just do blackdom and do it in the way that I'm talking about in the borderland studies. But I didn't know what I would find. And then I started looking at the evidence, and then a lot of things changed. So, any other comments? Intersections?
So when did this settlement really dissolve?
Okay, so 1929, the crash. Now, what happens with the crash? There is a credit crunch, right? So explorers or exploration companies couldn't get the capital to fund all of the different leases that were going on in Blackdom. However, the Blackdomites were receiving oil royalties well into the World War II era. So some of them had their land and they still had exploration going on years later, well into the World War II era. So 1930, it was dissolved. Now, this is what happened though. They already lived a dual life where they were good in Roswell, they visited Blackdom, so it was kind of, but once the credit crunch hit, they just stayed in Roswell, or the other half, Boyer, he moved to Vado, where his gravesite is, in 21 after he sold the church. So he wanted to spread it out because you can't kill the whole family if we're not in the same place, especially if I'm 200 miles south. So Vado was kind of like an attempt to make sure that there was another place to go in case there was something going on. So about 1930, but it was still producing money for black people well into World War II. How come? You know, there's a lot of reasons for that, but it also depends on what you define as black, because we just discussed earlier. So you're saying black, non-Hispanic? You're talking about like me? I could be Puerto Rican. No. I would say this. I would say this. Black people go where there's opportunity, and New Mexico is not where you would want to go if you wanted an opportunity. I'm just saying, if you're black, look, there's. Am I lying? I'm sorry. Go ahead. I love you.
I do.
I would appreciate that you brought in the women who are involved in this, because that's the inclusion of that intersectionality. So your thesis, I'm buying it, I'm interested, I appreciate the fill-in, there's a lot I can know. I'm out right now, but thank you.
Isn't there a big opportunity for economic resurgence in that area, especially now with the oil reserves being located down in the southern part of the state?
So, Gregory is spearheading. I'll just put it that way. He's making sure that we get all our ducks in a row as we're building. What happens, happens, but we're moving towards that end where we're resurrecting Blackton in one way, shape, or form. It may be in that area, it may not. Long story, it'll come out when, Gregory.
Don't some of those descendants still look
Yes.
keep the mineral rights?
You wanna?
Yeah, we're actually looking at acquiring and using land that's actually on Blackton now rather than in Roswell, and there's 640 acres that we're looking at. So that's where it's at.
Yes.
Is there still a significant black population in Roswell? I mean, comparatively?
Significant when it comes to black people in New Mexico, you have to kind of think, okay, significant compared to what? So yes, there is a significant black population in places like Hobbs and Clovis, which is amazing, right? And then you go to Portales, is that where, I don't want to get it wrong, Eastern? Is Eastern in Portales? You'll find black students there. And it'll come from, a lot of it from that, or they're also brought in as athletes. Significant? Anyway.
My question is, what is the relationship between this discussion and this direction and the race dialogue happening in New Mexico that often excludes black folks and the black experience in New Mexico?
Wow, that's a, you know what I mean? That's a good one. I'm gonna frame it in a way so that I can say it real quick. The University of New Mexico does not have an Africana Studies department. It needs one. So when you have this much Black history in New Mexico, it speaks to the need for a department so that young students can develop the stuff that at least I started or that Gregory started in arts. In architecture, there could be other studies done. There are all kinds of studies that can be done just on Blackdom. Understand, Blackdom was a footnote that I found. It was a footnote. So the conversation around Black people in New Mexico is, one, they need a voice. The other is institutional grounding, so that it can't be taken away by a new administration coming in and wiping out funding, for example. Is that what your question? Anyone else? Comments? Thoughts, concerns?
Good presentation.
Gregory, final words? I don't think I introduced him properly.
No, he didn't.
I got the ABD thing, and can you explain like who you are, your name, and like you know what I mean? Because I didn't do it justice. So.
Yeah, so I'm Gregory Waits. I did my thesis, which was called Multiple Migrations, on Blackdom. I found out about, I did not know that Blackdom existed. In fact, it was a theater person who came up to me and said, I know what you should do your thesis on. And she was correct. And it required me to just really do a lot of digging. At the time, it was the year 2000. Internet was incredibly slow. That's personal.
Never mind.
But I will say that I graduated in 2001. No, I came to New Mexico as an artist in residence here at the Center for Contemporary Arts, and then moved on back to my original love, which was architecture, in 1997. So and then I graduated in 2001, and got my master's in architecture. And then Blackdom was my thesis. Multiple Migrations was my thesis, and then I translated into Blackdom Memorial Gardens. And so that's what we're trying to do now, is create an infrastructure, an actual place, and rather than all of the intricacies of Roswell that went down in political dynamics, which is very interesting in and of itself, but I don't want to go into that. We'd like to try and implant this actually on Blackdom, and that's showing itself. So,
yes.
I would guess you're looking for donors for the memorial, and I tried going to blackdommemorial.org and nothing came up.
yes. So let me address that.
See, there are long stories in here that we can kind of shorten.
Yeah, so we are, if you should take that article, the magazine, so we're just at the beginning stages again of reinserting all of this. Blackdom.org, we haven't lost the name, but we kind of shut it down. It's going to be a work in process, building it back up, the website. But yes, we're going to be looking for donors, both here in New Mexico and nationally and internationally, and so that's where we're at. And hopefully soon, and maybe even in the next few weeks, that website should be back up.
You need it or no?
When you talk about the pooling of acreage, it's really unusual, and I kind of wondered how they split it up, because I was in a town in Missouri where they were fighting over where the driller was going to drill, and the neighbors were fighting each other, and some of them were trying to pool the acreage, but of course the people with the most acreage said, no, they're going to go for it. So how did they work out how the proceeds would be split, et cetera,
Money. It's just there was enough money for them to go, okay, cool. The other thing is people moved away.
Was it split according to how much acreage they owned? Or?
Those details will be in my book. I can't give you all the details. However, the way that they were able to, I think to put it to you like this, I gave you the story of Minnie, right? Does she seem like she fits into the system that they were creating?
Well, if it's incorporated in a certain way, or if they pool the acreage, she would have to.
You get what I'm saying? So the money kind of brought people together. It also caused them to fight in the streets of Roswell. Ooh, that's, again, it'll be in the book. But how they did it, the money has kind of stabilized it. Also, half of the people left and went to Vado. So a lot of the fighting didn't necessarily take place that normally would if they were all in the same place.
I think it's pretty sure they did. Yeah. Otherwise, it would have scattered everything.
It would be a nice screenplay, huh? Which, by the way, I did write a screenplay about it. And we can get to that. All right, so we're out of time. Thank you.